Opposition. Questions without notice. The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the fact that 5 out of the 7 closing the gap targets have not been met or are not on track. Will one of the 14 new targets set in April be a justice target?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, and I thank her for her constructive support of the process we are now going through in the establishment of the new Closing the Gap targets. As the member would be aware, that is a process that is a cooperative process. It's a process that's involving state governments, the Commonwealth Government, but most importantly it is a process which is being driven by the coalition of peak groups led by Pat Turner. And so, Mr Speaker, it would be presumptive of me as Prime Minister, as a part of this process, to be seeking to prejudice that process and not listen to what the priorities are to be set by Indigenous Australians. And that's exactly what we'll be doing. As I said today in my address on closing the gap, we want to see the gap from the eyes of Indigenous Australians. I want the gaps to be defined by Indigenous Australians. And so there is an engagement to that end. There will be a discussion of these matters in March of this year, and this is a process we've been working to for over a year now. And so I'll be looking to that coalition of peaks and Pat Turner, who has demonstrated amazing leadership in bringing all of those groups together. And most recently we met in the Cabinet room, as I referred to earlier today. It was a tremendous meeting, and we are making great progress. So I look forward to the shared targets with the right data that can inform us as to how we're tracking against those targets, where the responsibilities for meeting those targets are very clearly articulated. The suggestion that this Commonwealth Parliament alone can act to address all of these targets is a misplaced notion, because state governments, Mr Speaker, equally are part of this process, and that's not me saying it, Mr Speaker. It is Indigenous Australians through the coalition of peaks themselves. And that's why this process, Mr Speaker, is a partnership. I intend to respect the partnership with Indigenous Australians.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the minister inform the House how the Morrison government is working in genuine partnership with Indigenous Australians and state and territory governments to progress closing the gap?
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Barara for your continued and ongoing support and interest in these areas. The peak organisations came to the Prime Minister and met with him about the way in which we were doing business as Australian governments, and asked if it was possible for Aboriginal people to sit at the table to shape the direction for closing the gap into the future. The Prime Minister undertook that process, met with COAG, had the First Ministers agree to a process in which it would be a tripartite approach to developing the targets, that the Coalition of Peaks would work very closely with the Aboriginal community and with state and territory governments and with the Commonwealth. They had their first meeting when Senator Nigel Scullion was the minister responsible at the time. I had the privilege of sitting at the table at the first Joint Council meeting in Adelaide. And in that meeting, what we did is we took forward what was agreed to about the way in which we would shape the future that would leave a legacy of Indigenous involvement in decision-making. The other element to that was that ministers from each state and territory would sit there and be part of those discussions. It was historic in the sense that both Pat Turner and I sat as 2 Indigenous Australians co-chairing a COAG council. Unprecedented. And then what we did recently is the Prime Minister invited the peaks into the Cabinet room, and we talked about what was evolving out of their consultations on the targets. They're doing broad consultation right across the nation, and they will come back to us with the final set, but they're working with my agency, the National Indigenous Australians Agency, with Professor Ian, and I've got a medal, Anderson, sorry. And what they're doing is they are having genuine discussions around how we shape the future. And in doing that, I reflected on other elements of the work that we're doing. I've asked the agency now to always engage with our people on all initiatives that we do. They are not to tell communities what they need. They are to sit, identify the challenge, work on solutions. But I also want to ask all of us in this chamber to do the same, to engage within our electorates, to listen to the voices of people at the local level. Many of us do it well. Some of us depends on time. But if we do this consistently and we bring into the feedback for the peaks and the Aboriginal community, then let me say that we will have an outcome that is an exemplar for the future, and we can collectively take credit for the way in which we've engaged in a real way. Thank you.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister hold a referendum in this term to enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament in our Constitution?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition will be aware of my broad position on this as I outlined it in my Closing the Gap speech and the aspiration we have there. Mr Speaker, this process of constitutional recognition has been a long journey, and it is yet to arrive at a point, I think we can fairly say, where there is broad agreement as to what the proposition would be. Indeed, there is a large gap between where the opposition stands on the form of this and where the government stands, and I would have thought there would need to be a real consensus to enable such a referendum to be successful. Because, Mr Speaker, what I'm interested in is that such a proposition would be successful. Success is the goal that I would seek in pursuing that agenda, and it's an agenda that I am pursuing and the Minister for Indigenous Australians is pursuing. And one of the things I've learned carefully from the Minister for Indigenous Australians is you need to keep walking together until you can find the point where there is an agreement that would enable such an important recognition to be achieved. So I am not going to allow, Mr Speaker, any timetables to prevent the successful achievement of this result. My position on this matter I've set out very clearly, Mr Speaker. Those opposite have a very different view as to the manner and form of this to those in the government, and I think that presents, Mr Speaker, a lack of consensus. What we will do is continue to pursue the bipartisan recommendations of the Joint Select Committee, and I thank the member for Barara and the other members of the committee, Mr Speaker, who put forward those recommendations and put forward a process of co-design as the way forward. That's what we're doing. That's our policy. We will continue to apply ourselves to that process. I hope we're able to achieve a consensus at an early opportunity. But, Mr Speaker, in the absence of a consensus, I am not going to go down a path that would see something important such as this result in a failure.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is securing Australia's energy future by keeping the lights on, reducing power prices and meeting our emission reduction commitments? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the member for Robertson wants to keep the lights on like every member of this House. And the member for Robertson wants to ensure that we don't put taxes on people, that we don't drive up their electricity prices, that we ensure there is reliability in our grid, and she also shares the government's passion and commitment to ensure we meet our emissions reduction targets as we committed, and those targets that indeed we took to the last election, to the Australian people, and the plan that would see us achieve them. And as the Minister for Energy has reminded the House recently, electricity prices in the past year down 3.5%. We are the world leaders in renewable energy. 2.2 million Australian households have rooftop solar panels, the highest rate of uptake in the world. in 2019. Installed renewable capacity increased by 24% over 2018. Our previous record in renewable generation in 2019 was up 20% on 2018 levels and is forecast to grow by a further 26% in 2020. Gas is obviously a critical player in the future of our energy needs in this country, and that's why we're able to strike a deal with the New South Wales government which ensures we're getting the gas from underneath our feet, some 70 petajoules, Mr Speaker, which will increase the supply of gas alone in New South Wales by around 50%, so we're getting the gas. $1.4 billion in the Snowy 2.0, and then there's the Battery of the Nation projects, $1 billion for the Grid Reliability Fund. We are technology agnostic about these issues, Mr Speaker. We're supporting, through Battery of the Nation, the Beetaloo Gas Project, the Copper String Transmission Program, the Collinsville project, Mr Speaker, for new helicoal, and how that applies to a feasibility study. Mr Speaker, we have no policy allergies to energy production on this side of the House. But on that side, Mr Speaker, their energy policies are coughing and sneezing and spluttering all over the place, where they are unable to even nominate what their emissions retardant alternative is for 2030. The member for Hunter has a posse position. The member for Sydney has a position. Who knows what the each-way position is, Mr Speaker, of the Leader of the Opposition? They have no policy when it comes to sustainable and reliable energy for this nation's future. They are riven with division on this question. The alternative, and what is being pursued by a government, Mr Speaker, is power generation that can be relied upon to reduce electricity prices, to support industry and manufacturing jobs and the support of industry right across this country, while the opposition splutters all over the place.
Concluded. The member for Isaacs. The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. There are Indigenous communities in remote Australia that don't have access to kidney dialysis because they don't have potable water. Prime Minister, I have been to these places. Will you commit to ensuring that all communities in Australia have clean water?
The Prime Minister.
The Minister for Health to add to my answer on this very important matter. This was one of the important topics that I discussed with Pat Turner this morning. This is one of the critical things that needs to be put in place to support the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples right across the country. And as she reminded me this morning, that is made more difficult because of recent events around bushfires and drought, which has complicated the water potability for Indigenous Australians in so many parts of the country. So I can agree with the member who has put this matter to us. This is absolutely an issue that requires attention, not just from Commonwealth governments but from state governments as well, Mr Speaker, and it will be a matter that will be getting important attention through the process which I outlined in my previous answer to the earlier question. But it will also be one going forward as we pursue our water policies across the country. But I'll ask the Minister for Health to add to the answer.
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much to the Speaker and to the Prime Minister and to the member for Barton. In terms of potable water, the Prime Minister has set out the position and the commitment and the work that we're doing on that front. In terms of kidney dialysis, I had the privilege with the Minister for Indigenous Affairs of visiting Purple House in Alice Springs, focusing on a $23 million announcement for kidney dialysis. We know that renal failure and renal damage is an immensely important issue in Indigenous Australia, and then along with a number of areas of eradicating avoidable Indigenous blindness, eradicating avoidable Indigenous deafness, eradicating rheumatic heart disease. What we also want to do, I apologise, the Leader of the Opposition is coming between us. What we also want to do is to make sure that we help to work towards eradicating avoidable kidney failures. So the $23 million to Purple House is our commitment, and we will always continue to work with them on their needs, but we know this is important. I have seen the cases, I have visited the site, I have worked with the Minister for Indigenous Affairs as well as people on all sides, and I have to say Purple House is a great Australian initiative supported by people on all sides of this House, and it's about saving lives and protecting lives in Indigenous Australia.
Just before I call the next question, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon of Therese Rain, the wife of former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. The member for Kennedy.
Tourism Minister. Last Friday at Cairns Wildlife Dome, I risked my life flying in a harness only feet above a snapping 4.5-metre crocodile. Mr. Speaker, without a gun, risking my life for the dire straits of North Queensland tourism. Minister, I've done my bit, would others do theirs? By postponing bass payments for operators. I know a lot of you are rooting for the crocodile, but anyway. And whilst coronavirus is half the problem, the overvalued dollar, the lily pad left of the Liberal and Labor bad-mouthing what David Attenborough described as the most magical place on earth, our reef. Surely these latter two demand action.
And members on my left, just pause for a second. If you could read my mind, member for Kennedy, if you could read my mind. The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Kennedy for his question because it's an incredibly important question. The tourism industry is absolutely vital to Australia and in particular to regional and rural Australia, and there are many ways that we encourage tourists to Australia, and there are many ways that we encourage tourists to regional and rural Australia, and the member for Kennedy has obviously participated on one of those, and he obviously had a lot of fun. Can I say that we have a lot of things under consideration to help with the impact that coronavirus is having on local industries and local businesses, including looking at bass payments. We've done that for the bushfires, and we're also looking to see whether we need to expand that for the coronavirus as well. Can I say that I know this myself because there has been a large impact on travellers to the Great Ocean Road to go and see the magnificent 12 Apostles. It's been a huge impact on businesses and industry along there. The ATO are looking at ways that it can assist and it can help. And also we've got a $76 million tourism package that we have rolled out, which is going to try and help and improve domestic tourism so we can get tourists out of the capital cities into our regions, into our rural areas, make sure that we can get international tourists from other markets coming to our nation. We want to make sure that the tourism industry continues to thrive in this nation. We know that Chinese tourists have been a large contributor to the tourism sector here. We want to make sure that once we're through the coronavirus, once we can welcome Chinese tourists back to our shores, that they will know that they're welcome here and that there are wonderful, wonderful tourism operators who are providing all types of experiences, whether they be for Chinese visitors or whether they be for visitors from around the rest of the world. We want to make sure that we're backing and we're supporting our tourism operators. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please outline to the House how the Morrison government's resilient economy is continuing to help families, including in my seat of Chisholm, get ahead? Is the Treasurer aware of any threats that will undermine this?
The Treasurer.
Can I thank the member for Chisholm for a question and congratulate her on the strong contribution she is making in this place, Mr. Speaker, and on behalf of her constituents, more than 70,000 of whom are getting tax cuts courtesy of the legislation which we on this side of the House supported. And thousands of small businesses across her electorate and others are also getting the benefit of the extended instant asset write-off and the tax cuts that we have legislated through the parliament. Now, Mr. Speaker, when we came to government, unemployment was rising, investment was falling and the budget was in a mess. Now we have the first current account surplus in more than 40 years, the lowest welfare dependency in more than 30 years, the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, and the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. Now, the recent economic data, and these are inconvenient truths from the member for Rankin who likes to tax a lot. These are inconvenient truths for him. The December job numbers show that unemployment fell to 5.1%, 29,000 new jobs. Those aged between 15 and 64, 74.5% were in work. That was a record high, Mr Speaker. Household disposable income in the September quarter had its biggest jump in a decade, Mr Speaker. Building approvals are now up nearly 3% year-on-year. Retail trade volumes in the December quarter were higher than median market expectations and the fastest increase since 2018. Today, the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Survey had consumer sentiment up 2.3%, Mr Speaker. And we know from the Governor of the Reserve Bank that household balance sheets are improving. This is what he had to say recently. The loan arrears rate is coming down. The number of people who have problems with their personal debt is coming down, so it looks like, across a range of dimensions, balance sheets are in a better position. And he went on to say public and business balance sheets are in good shape. That's the Governor of the Reserve Bank. And on top of that, boosting household incomes are the tax cuts. More than $6 billion in the first 6 months of these tax cuts have gone into the pockets of hard-working Australians. And electricity prices, as the Minister for Energy and the Prime Minister have said, wholesale prices down around 30% on the same time last year. So, Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House are getting on with our economic plan that is delivering a record number of jobs, a record number of Australians in work, and lower taxes for all Australians, a great contrast to that high-taxing, high-spending proposals from those opposite.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Electricians and Plumbers Union was ordered to pay a fine for minor paperwork breaches, a fine which is double the amount that celebrity chef George Calombaris's businesses were ordered to pay for stealing the wages of more than 500 workers. Why does the government always have one rule for workers and another for employers?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the penalty imposed upon the CPU was determined by an independent judge of the Federal Court of Australia, applying the Labor government's own laws, Mr Speaker. And what workers care about is being paid the wages in which they're entitled, and that is what has happened in the Calombaris matter. Workers had been paid $7.8 million of wages they were owed thanks to the work of the government regulator, the Fair Work Ombudsman. And you may ask, Mr Speaker, how was that made possible? We have increased funding to the Fair Work Ombudsman by more than $60 million in recent years. And members of the House may want to know why we had to increase $60 million in funding to the Fair Work Ombudsman so they could go and do their job and ensure that workers who had been done at their payments would get their payments, Mr Speaker. And that is because when Labor were in office, they cut the Fair Work Ombudsman funding by almost 20%, Mr Speaker. 20%! Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker.
The member for
the
Gordon.
Hypocrisy of the Labor Party, who come in here and make these statements, and while at the same time are seeking to prevent the government from ensuring that workers' entitlement funds don't get ripped off by dodgy unions, is amazing. They have it every way, each way, every day, Mr Speaker.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison government is transforming regional Australia through the building of the Inland Rail?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom for his question, Mr Speaker. He understands just how important this nation-building infrastructure how it's going to transform not just his area, Mr Speaker, but the 1,700 kilometres from Melbourne to Brisbane. That is 1,700 kilometres of commerce, a corridor of commerce, a corridor of hope and optimism. Mr Speaker, he and I were there at the All Rights Good Morning Cereals factory, and they were extolling the virtues of the Inland Rail to be able to get their product to port quicker, to be able to get their product to markets quicker, to be able to get their product to other factories quicker, so that it can be processed, so that the goodness out of the Darling Downs and the Toowoomba region can be there for all the nation to enjoy. And whether it's the All Rights Good Morning Cereals, Mr Speaker, whether it's KB Concrete at Narromine, a town of 3,500 people, Mr Speaker, where brothers Ken and Ben McLean are going to benefit from this. Mr Speaker, it's Closing the Gap Day, and with the Narromine to Park section, there are 1,500 workers busy working on that line. 283 Indigenous workers, but perhaps even more importantly, Mr Speaker, 9 Indigenous businesses making sure that they also gain the benefits of the Inland Rail. And up in the gallery, Mr Speaker, there's the Mayor of Temora, Councillor Rick Furman. Now, his neighbouring shire of Junee is also going to benefit, but every shire, neighbouring shires right up and down the line, Mr Speaker, are going to benefit from the Inland Rail. It's going to get product to port within 24 hours. This is nation building. Now, they first started talking about it in 1890. The first plans were drawn up in early 1900, and the Liberal Nationals government is getting on and doing it. We turned the first sod on the 13th of December 2018 at Parkes. And Parkes is going to be the centre of the Inland Rail universe. It is already benefiting from concrete, from ballast, from workers, tying into this great project. And we know just how important it is. Let me tell you, each and every one of the state governments which has signed the intergovernmental agreement, they know too the benefits of the Inland Rail. It is nation-building infrastructure, and it's all part of the $100 billion infrastructure rollout that we're doing over the next decade. Every electorate, every community is benefiting from the wisdom of this government, from the delivery of this government, from the sure and stable economic conditions that we are giving this nation. And you can only do this when you're able to balance the books. You can only do this when you get your budget back into surplus. Those opposite, they don't know the definition of surplus.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that under the Morrison government, annual wages growth in every single quarter has been lower than in any quarter under the last Labor government?
The Treasurer has the call.
I can confirm that today real wages are growing at 0.6%, and that under Labor real wages are growing at just 0.4%, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, the reality is, under Labor, the real minimum wage went down in 3 out of the 6 years they were in government. Under us, real minimum wages have gone up every year under us. Now, Mr Speaker, the way to boost wages is through cutting taxes. And there's only one side of this House that took to the Australian people $387 billion of higher taxes. And it was the genius, the member for Rankin, together with the member for McMahon, who came up with $387 billion of higher taxes, which the member for Rankin said he was proud and pleased of.
Treasurer will resume his seat as the Treasurer concluded his answer. The member for REID. The member for REID.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government?
Member for REID will resume her seat. It's difficult to hear the member for REID when the member for Rankin and the Treasurer are carrying on their argument. I think you'll find it funny if you have to continue it outside. That The member for REID.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll start again. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's plan to lower power prices, reduce emissions and strengthen grid reliability in New South Wales, including in my electorate of REID, and is the Minister aware of any alternate approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for REID for her question. I congratulate her on the extraordinary work she's doing as the new member for REID. And like all of us on this side of the House, she's focused on driving down energy prices, making sure there's a fair deal for energy for all her constituents while we reduce emissions, Mr Speaker. And that's why we recently announced the landmark state energy deal with the New South Wales government, Mr Speaker. This is a good deal for the people of New South Wales, and it's a good deal for all Australians, Mr Speaker. The deal includes adding new supply to the electricity market, whether it's through new generation projects under the Underwriting New Generation program, or making sure there's enough supply for one of the newest and cleanest coal-fired generators in Australia at Mount Piper, Mr Speaker, strengthening transmission networks and reliability of the grid through projects like QNI and Humlick, and of course, Mr Speaker, dollar-for-dollar matching to support our emission reduction and clean energy technology investments, Mr Speaker, particularly focused outside the electricity grid in sectors like agriculture, industry and transport. And importantly, Mr Speaker, this deal includes a commitment from New South Wales for more than 70 petajoules of gas, Mr Speaker, in a market of only 120. 70 petajoules of gas. Now, we're already seeing a 35% reduction in the wholesale price of gas, but this is 70 extra petajoules in the New South Wales market, Mr Speaker. Now, we are happy to do similar deals with other states, Mr Speaker, right across Australia. We want this deal to be the first of many because state governments play a crucial role in working with the federal government to deliver a fair deal on energy and to reduce emissions. But those states must do the right thing, Mr Speaker. They must do the right thing. For instance, in Victoria there is a moratorium on onshore gas, conventional or unconventional, Mr Speaker. There is a blanket moratorium on gas in Victoria. Now, when it comes to those deals, whether it's New South Wales or Victoria, the principle is very simple. No gas, no cash. That's right, Mr Speaker. The principle's simple, no gas, no cash. Now, we're delighted to be working with the New South Wales government. We look forward to working with others, and we look forward, of course, to continuing to drive down the price of energy, drive down emissions, meet our international obligations, working closely with like-minded state governments.
The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Liberal member for Bega, Andrew Constance, reflecting my own experience in the region, stated, and I quote, "At the forums I've been at over the past 2 nights, the plea for help from business is about protecting casual employees and the need for a cash injection now. People are reluctant about loans." On Monday, the Prime Minister ridiculed Labor for standing up for businesses that don't want to take on more debt. Does the Prime Minister have the same response to the Liberal member for Bega?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that over 700,000 small businesses in the bushfire-affected communities have automatically been provided deferrals by the ATO. The member for Bega has highlighted the issue of cash flow and the impact on cash flow for small businesses. Around 90,000 of these small businesses obviously have staff. They have also provided deferrals to 445,000 entities related to these small businesses. These automatic deferrals are in place for another 3 months until the 28th of May. Overall, they're also alleviating cash flow pressures in communities. Overall lodgement and payment deferrals have been granted to 3.9 million taxpayers. That's individuals, businesses and self-managed super funds. They are prioritising cash flow back into communities. The ATO has also automatically prioritised refunds for bushfire impacted communities over the past few months. From the 15th of November to the 5th of February, the ATO has issued over 420,000 refunds to the value of $3.2 billion to around 348,000 taxpayers in bushfire-affected communities. And the ATO Emergency Support Hotline is available to those outside of the identified impact areas who are seeking assistance with lodgement and payment deferrals. Mr Speaker, the member would be aware of the grant programs that are available to small businesses, and he would be very aware, and he'd be pleased to know that of those programs, Mr Speaker, those small businesses are now starting to take up those grants where they're eligible for those grants through the program being administered by the New South Wales Government. But, Mr Speaker, the member opposite seems to be suggesting that a different approach should be taken. I'm responding to the member's question. The suggestion being made that somehow the government should be providing an insurance for income loss, Mr Speaker, across the country in relation to any natural disaster. If that were to be the case, that would be in stark contrast. Mr Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition wants to make a contribution, he can wait till after question time, Mr Speaker, or he can ask a question. I'm trying to address the very serious question of supports for small business, which the member has asked me in good faith. Mr Speaker, that it is not the government's policy to provide cash flow assistance for businesses for income loss that have not had direct impact of natural disasters. That is the policy followed by the Labor government when they were in power. It is the policy that we have applied to other natural disasters, in particular up in North Queensland, whether up in Townsville or across the areas affected by those floods. Mr Speaker, in the areas you're talking about, there is some 165,082 businesses alone that have employees. If we were to follow the approach that Labor seem to be suggesting, that alone would be some $8 billion, and if you applied it to all businesses, it would be $22 billion. Mr Speaker, the opposition cannot be taken seriously when they're suggesting those sorts of—
Members on both. The member for Monash.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on the role technology will play in the Morrison's government's plan to secure Australia's energy future, and how will this help keep our economy strong? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And he, like all of us on this side of the House, is focused on reducing emissions whilst maintaining a strong economy, Mr Speaker, whilst maintaining a strong economy. Now, we are absolutely focused on meeting and beating our targets, Mr Speaker. We have strong targets, we have a clear plan, and we have an enviable track record. Indeed, Mr Speaker, we expect to beat our Kyoto 2020 targets by 411 million tonnes, and to put that in perspective, that's almost a year's worth of emissions. We'll beat our 2020 targets by, Mr Speaker. We have strong 2030 targets that imply a reduction of emissions per capita by 50%, Mr Speaker, by 50%, and already we've laid out in our plans how we're going to meet and beat those 2030 targets, Mr Speaker, and central to that is the $3.5 billion Climate Solutions Fund and, of course, state deals like the New South Wales deal I just talked about. Now, Mr Speaker, the pathway to meaningful emissions reduction both before 2030 and beyond is the development and deployment of technologies, Mr Speaker, commercial technologies which strengthen the economy and don't weaken it. Commercial technologies which reduce emissions whilst creating jobs, Mr Speaker, and that's why last year at COAG, just before Christmas, we announced alongside all state and territory governments our national hydrogen strategy, Mr Speaker, and soon afterwards we committed over $500 million to that strategy. Now, that includes projects like the Latrobe Valley Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain. In itself a $500 million project, we've committed $50 million to get that export supply chain in place for the future to reduce not just emissions in Australia but to reduce emissions around the world. Now, Mr Speaker, we'll shortly release our technology investment roadmap because our focus is on technology, not taxes. Now, Mr Speaker, there is an alternative, which is to tax Australians more. And we have a real-world example of what happens when you try to tax Australians more. It was the carbon tax. Those had in place, before they lost government. Now, Mr Speaker, I have here a document which is the projections from 2012,
Members on my left.
of what Labor.
The minister will resume his seat. Members on my left might notice that their leader is seeking the call. The Leader of the Opposition, I'm taking, has risen on a serious point of order. The Leader of the Opposition.
Absolutely, Mr Speaker. You won't be surprised we want to check the validity of the document.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. You can ask that it be tabled at the end of the answer, not midway through an answer. Yeah, OK. Well, I know what the standing orders say, and they're real. And you well know that you can only ask for a document to be tabled at the end of question time. The minister has the call.
Speaker, it lays out Labor's plan for their carbon tax. Mr Speaker, and what they forecast back in 2012 was that by 2020, Mr Speaker, by 2020, emissions in Australia would be 637 million tonnes, 100 million tonnes higher than they are today.
The minister's time has concluded. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, I'd ask the minister to either table or let us know the web address of the document that he referred to.
Do you want him to table it or not? Is the minister quoting from a confidential document? OK. Thank the minister. The member for Eden Monero.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister advise the House how many loans to businesses impacted by the fires nationwide have been approved? Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, as I advised the House only a few days ago, I think in response to one of the questions that may have been raised directly by the member, the loans program has only recently opened. It was opened, I understand, on the 3rd of February of 2020. And 232 applications have been received under the review since that time. They are currently being assessed by the New South Wales Government. They haven't approved any at this point. It's only been going since the 3rd of February, Mr Speaker. In Queensland, concessional loans also opened on the 3rd of February, and there have been 2 applications there received and 1 has been approved. In South Australia, they have approved the scheme and 60 EOIs have been received, and guidelines are currently being considered by the Victorian Government, who have not put in place the assessment processes at this point to provide those loan arrangements. But I can confirm in the member's home state 232 applications have been made to access those loans.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is backing industry to harness technology and develop technology to create jobs and make our economy stronger? And is the minister aware of any alternative approach?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, and I note that she is a highly qualified medical professional. She's one of my Women in STEM colleagues on this side of the House, and she knows, along with all of the members on this side of the House, that science and technologies are the greatest tools that we have to tackle the challenges that we're facing now and into the future. And importantly, they're tools that we can use to enhance our economy, grow our economy and to create some more jobs. And there's enormous opportunity for Australia to punch well above its weight on the international stage, whether it's with low-emission technologies, the digital economy, AI, alternative energy, advanced manufacturing processes or the space sector. Our government knows that the way forward is through technology and innovation. Now, Mr Speaker, technology is a very broad term, but essentially you can categorise it as using scientific knowledge for practical purposes. So it's about developing new and better ways of doing things. And of course that's very different to those opposite who really only have the one same old way to deal with issues. And that, of course, Mr Speaker, is higher taxes. So Labor really has never ever encountered a challenge that it did not try and solve with higher taxes. That's entirely different to what we try and do here. Now, Mr Speaker, it's very clear that they are a taxing opposition. They took to the last election $387 billion in higher taxes. And in fact, they have taken higher taxes to the last 4 elections. So they're a pretty unimaginative bunch, Mr Speaker, when you think about it. There's not a lot of innovation happening on that side of the House. It is just tax, tax, tax again and again. But, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we're about technology. We're not about taxes. We're about technology to solve problems, not dipping into the pay packets of hard-working Australians. Now, we are tackling and using technology in multiple ways. And, for example, last weekend we invested $20 million for plastics recycling. That includes a plant in Victoria that will be turning hazardous building waste into recycled shoes and new building products. So we're using technology, not taxes. And importantly, by doing this, we're creating the jobs of the future. In fact, 9 jobs are created for every 10,000 tonnes of waste that we recycle. And given that there's around 30 million tonnes of waste that we are yet to recycle each year, the opportunity for job creation is huge.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. In 2018, the Prime Minister claimed that he had begun work on a National Integrity Commission at the beginning of that year. It's now 2020. Where is the government's National Integrity Commission legislation?
The Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the legislation's with me. It's very well advanced, 350 pages at the moment. Well, the Labor proposition, Mr Speaker, is that because the government wants to take the time to properly design and consult on something as important and as complicated as a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, that somehow the Labor parties are the paragon of integrity, because we want to take the time. And the reason why I find that as a proposition fairly hard to take seriously is threefold. First, when Labor announced a commitment to an Integrity Commission, they radically underfunded their proposal, allocating $58.7 million. In our previous budget, we allocated $106.7 million, which is on top of the $40.7 million of existing funding. The second reason I take their proposition, I find their proposition hard to take seriously is that they themselves said that this is a complicated matter that would take time to draft, then require time to consult on. Indeed, the member for Maribyrnong said, as you would appreciate, a reform of this magnitude is complex and would require extensive consultation and design work. In their own policy document, they said a draft would be produced if they were elected 12 months after the election, which time we are well inside. The third reason I take their proposition that they are paragons of integrity with a grain of salt is that when this issue was first raised with the Shadow AG, he said, "I'm not convinced there is a need for another integrity officer." Bit of a problem with a skiing trip was the context of that being raised. They have no model themselves, so that means that they have at once declined to support the Greens model but then supported the Greens model. Another reason I find their proposition difficult to stomach is that the Labor Party themselves have tried to—
Attorney-General will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It was a very clear question. It didn't go to alternatives or anything else. It went to their own commitment.
I'm taking it as a point of order on relevance. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I've been listening very carefully. I know the Leader of the Opposition has taken his point of order, but I do have to say everything that the attorney's been saying goes to the timetable and the reasons for the timetable the government's taking. He's entitled to answer the question that's been asked and be relevant to the question. And every aspect, I have to say, that he has raised goes directly to the timetable that the government has for this legislation. The attorney has the call.
Mr Speaker, of course then there's the little integrity problem of 10 failed referrals on serious criminal matters, all of which have come back with 0. But of course, the most interesting thing of all is the way in which the Labor Party have sought to link support for an integrity commission to party political fundraising. Can you believe it? At the time that they announced their commitment to an integrity commission, an email comes out from the Labor Party. It begins with the sentence, "Politics is about trust." So far, so good. Then it says, "Will you pledge your support for a National Integrity Commission?" And how do you do that? By clicking on the little red button that says "Donate $5 to the Labor Party." So in an email where they pretend that they are the only side of politics supporting an integrity commission, they lead people to believe that the only way they can get an integrity commission is to donate money to the Labor Party. And who sent out that email? The Shadow Attorney General. The more money you pay, the more integrity you get.
The member for Mallee. Members on my right, member for Goldstein and others. The member for Mallee has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is backing the future of farming in Australia to help reach the target of a $100 billion agriculture sector by 2030?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Mallee for her question? In fact, the electorate of Mallee is one of the agricultural engine rooms of this nation, producing some of the best grain, grapes, citrus, and in fact taking advantage of those free trade agreements that we put around our primary producers to reach that $100 billion goal by 2030. And we all have a role to play in that, and we do as a government as well. And we're signing up to that, not only in the here and now and supporting our farmers through some of the worst natural disasters we've seen, from fires and also through the drought. Over $2 billion, more than $2 billion committed already for the recovery from fires, but the $8 billion in commitments for the drought, ensuring that we kick-start the recovery when the rains do come. And they have come, and while they are pleasing to see, one shower rain doesn't break the drought. We'll continue to support our farmers through our national drought strategy, through the 3 pillars, supporting our farmers in the here and now, giving them the dignity and respect of putting food on the table, but also under our 2nd pillar, supporting the communities that support them, understanding that this drought extends past the farm gate into the communities that support them, but also the 3rd pillar, looking to the future. We are the first government to look to the future and understand that the next drought starts the very next day after the rains stop. So I'm proud to say that last night we tabled under the Future Drought Fund a $5 billion investment, paying a $100 million dividend every year. Last night we tabled that plan to be implemented on the 1st of July, a pay-down of $100 million a year to build the resilience, to kick-start the recovery of agriculture in this country from one of the worst droughts in our nation's history. But we're not stopping there. We've also made a $3 billion commitment to the states, who have the constitutional responsibility to go and dig the holes, to plumb the nation, to get the water infrastructure, to drive the growth. We are not shirking our responsibility. We are saying we will go hand in hand with you with over $3 billion. But we are saying to them, get moving, because that $100 billion target can only be done with water. We've gone further than that. We're also saying to our farmers, who understand more than anyone that the health of the environment of their land is intrinsically tied to their profit and loss. So we're creating a biodiversity stewardship fund to reward our farmers for the stewardship of their land, the good stewardship of their land. They should be rewarded for that. We're making sure also that we're making one of our biggest investments in one of the biggest assets we have, this precious human capital of those people in regional and rural Australia. We've had a generation of young people drained out of regional and rural Australia because agriculture wasn't popular, but it's sexy again. And we're going to create another pillar of agriculture by modernising our research and development to take up the new jobs of agriculture, to bring our young people home to understand that they play a significant part in agriculture's future of driving to $100 billion by 2030. We have faith and confidence in agriculture, but more importantly, we have faith and confidence in regional rural Australia.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Can the minister confirm that of the 14 regions affected by cuts to Medicare bulk billing incentives, 8 are in Labor electorates, 6 are in Liberal electorates, but none are in Nationals electorates?
The Minister for Regional Health. Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm there has been no cuts to GP bulk billing. There has been a change. There has been a change to geographic location using information from the Bureau of Statistics, and that is an update on information from 30 years ago. And so areas in metropolitan, outer metropolitan areas that may have been regional are now part of larger metropolitan areas, and so they are the ones that are impacted. But GPs in those areas are still eligible for district of workforce priority. They still can bulk bill, and those changes have not happened.
The member for Lindsay, the member for Shortland. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government's strong financial position has enabled us to build once-in-a-generation infrastructure projects like the Western Sydney International Airport? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
Minister for Population.
Can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and for her incredible advocacy for the Western Sydney Airport, as well as her incredible advocacy for having local jobs for local people, because she knows that hundreds of thousands of people have to leave Western Sydney each day to get jobs elsewhere, and she wants to see that change. I can confirm, Mr Speaker, that the Western Sydney International Airport is on track for takeoff in 2026.
Yeah.
Now, this huge undertaking is underway because of our $5.3 billion commitment, and, Mr Speaker, it's literally transforming the landscape in Western Sydney today. When it's first open in 2026, this airport will be the size of Adelaide's airport, with full discount airlines and premium airlines going. By 2060, we forecast that this airport will be the size of what Los Angeles Airport is today. And when it's open, Mr Speaker, we're also committed to ensure that there's rail infrastructure in place, there's freeway infrastructure in place, rolling out the Western Sydney City Deal around it to take advantage of the economic opportunities which it presents. But also, Mr Speaker, critically, this project is about jobs, as the member for Lindsay knows. In the construction phase alone, 11,000 jobs are being created. In the operational phase, 28,000 direct and indirect jobs will be created from the development of the Western Sydney Airport. And what's more, Mr Speaker, these jobs are local jobs. We set ourselves a target of having 30% of the jobs going to local people. In fact, over half the jobs are going to local people already, and we hope that that will continue. But, Mr Speaker, you can only do these types of massive nation-building projects if you manage your finances well. And the fact is that Labor could not do this because they didn't have the money. And the Leader of the Opposition, as people know, was the Infrastructure Minister for these 6 long years of the Labor government. And in 2009, the middle of that Labor government, he said in relation to the Western Sydney Airport, and he said, and I quote, "It is vital that we commence work now," he said, in 2009. What happened? Absolutely nothing. And why did nothing happen? Because they stuffed the budget, they ran out of money, they were spending money on pink bats and overpriced school halls and green loans and cash to dead people and to farm animals. That's
That is what the Labor Party was doing, Mr Speaker. Whereas on this side of the House, we know that to build nation-building infrastructure, you have to manage your finances, and that's exactly what we're doing.
The minister's time has concluded. Member for Ballarat, member for Sydney, member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health, and I refer to his previous answer in which he claimed there have been no cuts to bulk billing incentives. Can the minister explain to the House what the financial incentive for bulk billing was in affected areas in dollar terms before the government's change and what it is now?
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to add to my last answer. The changes that were made were geographic changes. They were not changed. They were not changed by electorate. They were changed by geographical area from the Bureau of Statistics. I can confirm that, and I think it's important to know that rural bulk billing incentives go to rural areas. That's the idea. The member for Shortland of rural and regional incentives.
Minister will pause. The member for Shortland will leave under 94A. The minister has the call.
That all doctors who bulk bill, regardless of their location, will continue to be eligible for bulk billing incentive. These changes relate to the higher rural bulk billing incentive. And the government has delayed these implementations from the 1st of July 2019 until the 1st of January to allow these practices to come to terms with these changes. And I can assure the members, if they want their doctors to find out more about this, they can go to check their modified Monash classifications on the Doctor Connect website.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question...
no, sorry. It's the call alternates. Yeah, no, he did. Leader of the Opposition resume his seat. Member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer and the Minister for Housing. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is building an even stronger Australia by supporting Australians into their first home through the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme? Thank you.
The Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Ryan for his question, because the member for Ryan is a champion for first home buyers in his electorate, as are all members on this side of the House. Mr Speaker, the Morrison's government's focus and commitment to support first home buyers is successfully helping more Australians get into a home sooner. Indeed, the latest ABS lending indicators highlight that the broad recovery that we're seeing in the Australian property market has been underpinned by first home buyers. They are driving the recovery in housing. Indeed, mortgage approvals for first home buyers were up by 6.2% month on month, which is the best outcome in a decade. And, Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to report to the House that it's just over a month since the Morrison government's pre-election commitment to establish the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme has been successfully commenced. The First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, importantly, allows prospective first home buyers to purchase a property with a government guarantee with a deposit of as little as 5%. Because, Mr Speaker, we know for first home buyers, one of the biggest struggles for them is getting the deposit together. Banks are requiring more and more deposits of 20%, which are incredibly difficult to save for. So with the Morrison government's First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, people can get into the market with as little as a 5% deposit. Since its commencement, just over a month ago, nearly 6,000 places under the scheme have been reserved and 3,000 places have progressed to pre-approval. The member for Ryan would be very pleased to hear that in his home state of Queensland, over 700 first home buyers have already received a pre-approved place under the scheme, In New South Wales, it's over 1,100 first-home buyers, 800 in Victoria, 150 in WA, 150 in South Australia, over 100 in Tasmania and over 100 in the ACT and the Northern Territory. It's very pleasing that these places have been distributed throughout the country in cities, regional centres and rural areas. And also, the scheme is reaching the Australians that our Prime Minister wanted to reach, people on middle incomes. Of those that have obtained a pre-approved place under the scheme, we've got an average income of $67,000 for singles and $110,000 for couples, which is really hitting and assisting the areas of the economy that we want to. So the Morrison government, like all Liberal and national governments, is the best friend of first home buyers, and we will continue to be so.
Member for Eden Monero.
My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Minister, can you explain why the government has cut Medicare bulk billing incentives in my bushfire-affected electorate, making it harder for doctors to bulk bill children and pensioners?
The Minister for Regional Health.
I will remind the member for Eden Monero that the changes that he is referring to passed this House on the 14th of October, unopposed.
Member for McMahon.
I welcome the opportunity on a day like today to speak about rural health. On the day where we announced another 100 training places for the Rural Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine, generalist pathways, putting doctors into areas such as the honourable member's electorate, servicing those regional areas. There has been no change to the regulation. The changes are an update from the Bureau of Statistics. They are agreed for both sides of this House, and it's important. It is important to remember.
Members on my left.
Important to remember that this policy is to service regional and rural remote education, health, and those changes purely on the demographics of the areas mentioned. There's been no change to bulk billing.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
The minister just referred specifically to a piece of legislation he alleged had passed this House. I asked him to table it.
No, well, there's 2 points. There's 2 points. The Manager of Opposition Business resume his seat. If the Minister for Health I was going to say to the Manager of Opposition Business, if he or anyone else has an issue with the minister's answer, they know they can deal with that at the end of question time. Secondly, I'm not going to ask ministers to table legislation that you've got. The member for Bowman.
Thank you, Speaker. A question for the Minister of Health. Will the minister update the House on what actions the Morrison government is taking to protect Australians' health from the outbreak of the coronavirus?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Bowman, who has been a great advocate for public health and a practitioner of public health all of his life. Earlier today, we were provided with the latest figures that there are 44,754 cases of coronavirus worldwide. Sadly, there are now 1,112 people who have lost their lives to coronavirus. In Australia, the number of cases remains at 15. And as I said previously, 5 have now cleared the virus, which is a very positive development. In addition to that, there is ongoing testing going on around the country where there are any cases which might be suspected, or in many cases which are nearly only possibilities. At Howard Springs, at the facility there, 13 cases have been tested and found to be negative. It was a low probability from the outset, but the AUSMAT team, in conjunction with NT Health, was not taking any chances, and their view was they would rather test every single possible case rather than put anybody at risk of not being treated early. Equally, on Christmas Island, we've now had 3 cases tested. All have been found to be negative. 2 have been double confirmed on that. The 3rd is awaiting the double confirmation from the reference laboratory. But the real point here is that we have in place a system in Australia which, at this point, and I stress at this point, is containing the spread. We have seen in Hubei province some of the extraordinary human hardship as well as the loss of life where it has not been contained. Chinese authorities have moved to contain it to Hubei. We have moved as a country to ensure that we have the strongest containment practices in place. Part of that has been what we have done with our border arrangements, and I want to thank everybody involved for their work on that front. In particular, our medical professionals who have acted early, and as part of that, we have made available today an additional 300,000 surgical masks to GPs, to medical professionals and to chemists for their use and for not for sale, but for their use and for the use of any of their customers whom they may believe might be at risk. And so, for that reason, we've had a great national task with support from states and territories, from support from medical practitioners, support from people on all sides. And so I want to thank everybody. I'm also aware that there are those on board cruise ships abroad, and with the Foreign Minister and DFAT we have agreed to set up support for some who may have mental health challenges in this circumstance. Being confined to a small situation can be deeply distressing. They could be fearful about their health, they could be suffering from anxiety or other conditions, and so over the course of the next 24 hours, to get ahead of any risks, we are setting those facilities up. I want to thank everybody and say our job is to protect Australians, and we're doing it.
Just on indulgence, the Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, can I just thank, on behalf of the Opposition, the Minister for organising a comprehensive briefing we had yesterday with the Chief Medical Officer, with myself and the Shadow Minister for Health. The Shadow Minister for Health has had regular briefings on this matter. This is a critical national interest matter, and I thank the Minister for the professional way in which he's conducted himself and his office.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.